Well, thank you very much for coming, for staying the course. There are a few empty seats, but I don't blame people. This is a pretty tough gig, really. Someone said earlier I've got the graveyard slot, which means you're all in the graveyard. Well, how do I wrap up a brilliant day? Prithvi, nice to see you. It's good to see so many friends here today. Every single talk we've heard today has been absolutely amazing. And what I thought that I would do, I said to Tom, well, why don't I just bring together all of the superlatives of the Burma campaign, because the Burma campaign is one extraordinary story. Actually, it's millions of extraordinary stories. Indeed, it's 1.3 million extraordinary stories. Someone said to me earlier, you're going to do the numbers, aren't you, Rob? Yes, I'm going to do the numbers, because it's really important that we all understand that this was a multinational coalition, imperial effort. This wasn't a British army fighting a British campaign against a British army. And someone, it might have been Jeremy, Jeremy was interviewing one of his African veterans and asked him, why did you fight for the British? And the answer was, well, who else would do it? The truth is, I asked that question as well when I went out to India for the first time in 1997, courtesy of the Army. They paid for my PhD, and I was allowed to go and interview lots of Indian veterans. That was one of the questions I asked. I was very young and naive, and I thought, well, why did you join Well, you weren't joining the British Army, of course, but I had assumed, rather stupidly, that our interests in Britain weren't necessarily aligned with those of the people in India. And over 35 years or more of doing this, the big Damascene experience for me is realizing that the interests of the Indian people were at the heart of why they raised the largest volunteer army of all kind, because they wanted to fight the Japani. Auchinleck famously said, I expect all of my officers, my Indian officers, he meant, to be a nationalist. And he was absolutely right. You need to be proud of your country. You need to be concerned about the future of your country. You must want to own the future of your country. And that's why you join up. And that's the reason why the first Indian veteran I interviewed in Guwahati, little dusty town, the Brahmaputra at Guwahati, said to me, Rob, I joined the army because I read the newspapers. We read and we knew all about Nanjing. We did not want the Japani in India. So it's an extraordinary story. It's a story of, as Slim famously described it, defeat into victory. It was the longest campaign of British military history. You've seen a variation of this slide before with Lucy. It's quite good to see all these slides being reused in various presentations. The longest British or imperial land campaign of the Second World War. One of the extraordinary things about this campaign is it started and continued into early 1943, a campaign of dismal failure, strategically, operationally, and tactically. Men, frankly, were not good enough, British nor Indian, to take on the Japanese in battle. Now, the Japanese had lots of advantages in 1941-42. They had starters' advantage. They had prepared for this campaign. The great advantage for the Allies over the period of the campaign was that we got better, and they didn't. In 1944 and 45, the Japanese were fighting in the same way they'd been fighting in 1942. That was a serious mistake for them. As I think Alan said earlier, Japanese commanders were just not good enough. And they weren't good enough because when their tactical schemes failed, they just threw their men, Bushido-like, into battle and were slaughtered. Another Indian I interviewed many years ago said to me, the Japanese were easy to kill. And I said, well, why was that? And he said, I was on the Shenham saddle. So this is July 1944. I joined the army in 1943. I had 9 months of basic infantry training, wherever Alan's gone. 9 months of infantry training. Some of you have heard me say this before. When I joined the army in 1981, I did 29 weeks of combat infantry training, and I thought I was a great warrior at the end of it. Little did I know that I wasn't. 9 months of infantry training, followed by, he was then given time off, I don't know how long it was, 2, 3, 4 weeks, to travel right across India to go home and visit his family. He then came back, and he then did 2 full months of collective training. That's training in your unit for jungle warfare. So Indian soldiers by 1944, they were recruited in 1943, had 11 months of training behind them. The Jungle Book, which Alan put up, a fabulous book, do read it. It's very short, it's only about 45, 50 pages. It's got a full distillation of the brilliance of the ideas that came to the Indian Army, less so the British Army in 1942 and 43 about defeating the Japanese. Paramount is training. You train hard and you fight easy. An interesting thing which Alan brings out in his fabulous book, Training the Indian Army for War, forgive me, Alan, I can't remember the exact title, brilliant book, by the way, is that the Indian Army and the British Army trained differently. They had different pamphlets. They had different organizations in the training structures. They didn't bring their training together. It's extraordinary, isn't it? There is a phrase known as the armies in India. There were 2 armies in India, the Indian Army, and it operated on its own basis, and there was the British Army in India, and it operated on its own basis. It's very interesting to see how the British training differed to the Indian training. The British went out to Australia. They sent a number of people out to Australia in 1942, early 1943, and said, let's distill the lessons of the Kokoda Trail and the fighting in New Guinea. And 180 Australians of experience in fighting the Japanese were then sent to India to help train the British divisions, not the Indian divisions. It's a fascinating insight into how the Indian Army and the British Army didn't actually operate together until they came together in brigades and divisions and ended up having to fight alongside each other. So here are the numbers. Let's get the numbers out of the road to start with. 1.3 million men and some women in Southeast Asia Command in 1945, of whom nearly 60%, so 58% were Indian, just over 20% were American, about 8% were British. A similar percentage were African, this is West and East African, and a significant number were Chinese as well. These were men from the Chinese army, recruited by the Chinese army, flown to India, flown to Ranchi, trained by the British, paid for by the British, and deployed as part of the Northern Combat Area Command under, first of all, General Stilwell, up until 1944. It's an extraordinary army. It's the largest army the Allies pulled together in the Second World War. 58% of these men, 2 million men by April 1945, and about 30,000 women were volunteers, the largest volunteer army in the history of mankind. So that's one superlative, the crazy numbers. Of those, 606,000 were in the fighting forces, operational troops, as Mountbatten's report describes them. So there's a difference between 1.3 million and 606,000. What are the other 600,000 or more doing? They're maintaining some crazy lines of communication, and we'll come back to that in a moment. They're feeding a crazily large army. They're farming. There were 30,000 Nagas full-time employed on keeping the Dimapur to Imphal road open from June 1944. It's quite extraordinary. But of the 606,000 fighting troops, nearly 90%, 87% of these fighting troops were Indian. This was an Indian army fighting an Indian campaign with a bunch of Brits interspersed amongst them. And we're very, very slowly, some of you have heard me say this before, going back 35 years, but we are very, very slowly making an impact, aren't we? Because only last week in the Indian Express, President Modi, is he President or Prime Minister? I always forget. Mr. Modi said Kohima was the turning point of the Second World War in India. It was an Indian victory. Hallelujah. It's really, really good to see those little snippets of information that we're trying to leave everywhere actually being picked up and recognized for what they are. In terms of superlatives, Paul Corden made this point perfectly. The whole point about Burma was to keep China in the war. A slight mismatch on the numbers. There were 1.2 million Japanese troops in India, could we include Manchuria, in 1943. 1.2 million. Now, there was a key imperative of the Allies to keep Chiang Kai-shek fighting the Japanese rather than fighting the communists under Mao Zedong. But there's a little bit of a nuance here, and the nuance is that Chiang Kai-shek threatened the Allies with stepping back from the war and not engaging the Japanese if the Burma Road was not recommissioned. So the Burma Road, as Paul showed you, and a number of people showed you, went 1,800 miles from Rangoon to Mandalay to Lashio, up to Bamo, and then all the way into Chongqing in Yunnan province on the Yellow River. 1,800 miles. And that was cut off in 1942. It was replaced by the Hump. We'll come back to the Hump in a moment. I'll give you some more numbers. Some of you have heard these numbers before. I hope you can remember them. But this was the strategy, keeping China in the war. Churchill didn't want to involve himself in a land campaign in Burma. He described it as akin to jumping into the sea to wrestle with a shark. It's the sort of thing that only stupid people did. Why on earth would you invade Burma when actually the easiest thing would be to launch an amphibious campaign against Malaya to take Singapore, and Burma would fall into your hands? Chiang Kai-shek was the reason why we got involved in Burma in the first place. It wasn't for reasons of saving England's Asian colonies, which Al Weidemeier told Roosevelt. He argued in early 1944 the Brits only wanted to get involved in Burma to recover their colonies. Utterly wrong, completely untrue. Britain didn't want to go back into Burma. Al Weidemeier wasn't smart enough to realize it. We've had some talk this morning in a brilliant conversation led by Alan about the rebuilding of the Indian Army. This is one of the extraordinary superlatives of the Second World War. It's hard to overestimate, is that what I want to say, how important this was for the future of India. And Alan's written a very good book on this. David and Missy's written it was David who mentioned this. David is a brilliant historian of India, and I'm so looking forward to his book because the Indian Army that we saw arrive, 2 million men and some women in 1943, was representative, as David said earlier, of a national interest, a national campaign, a new idea about what India was. In a very short order of time, the reluctant Britons had recognized that actually there was a new India knocking on the doorstep, asking for independence. This was the opportunity. The Burma campaign was the door through which India stepped to independence. It's very important to understand how the Indian Army gave sense and purpose and context to the Indian desire for independence. And how do we know that? Well, every single member of Congress, remember Subhash Chandra Bose had been thrown out of this big tent a long time before, privately told Indians who went to them, Nehru and Gandhi, what should I do? Should I join the Indian Army? And they all said, yes, it's important that you protect India now, and it's important that you are here when India finally becomes independent. Gandhi and Nehru recognize the importance of this. And one of the extraordinary things that still blows me away is the power of what soldiers call operational maneuver in Burma in 1942. Now, I'm just going to pause and say, we've had a long hiatus in Burma campaign studies in terms of good books. It's going back 20 years. Every now and again, a book comes out. But in the last year or two, we've had a flurry of really amazing books, and it's hugely exciting. We heard Lucy talk about the Jungle Commandos. It's a little bit misnamed, the book. It's actually about Arakan 1, 2, and 3. Arakan 1 and 2 sets the scene for Arakan 3, and it's a brilliantly told story. So if you don't have Lucy's book, do make sure you go and get it. Jack Belcher can't be here today. He's produced 2 superb books. really, he would forgive me for saying they're surprisingly good books. One on armor in the Burma campaign, which blew me away. The second, and it's very, very good. He's done the hard yards of the research, which is very good to see. The second is Thunder Run. It's just come out a few months ago, and it's the story of this great battle of Mektila, where the 4th Indian Armored Corps absolutely smashed Kimura's defensive plan for Burma. We'll come back to that in a moment. But we're talking about 255 tank brigade with 125 Shermans advancing into contact with infantry in armor, basically Shermans with the turrets taken off the head. We actually had too many tanks by 1945, believe it or not. Priests, 105 millimeter artillery pieces welded into tank chassis and providing direct and indirect fire alongside the tanks, all in contact by wireless with cab ranks of Harry bombers, and by 1945 with Typhoons as well, on call to the infantry commander on the ground. That's fantastic combined arms maneuver seen in the Burma campaign. And I have told James Hollanders many times I would 100% take the 4th Indian Armoured Corps under Frank Messervy and throw it into the Northern Army Group in France, and they would do absolutely brilliantly. They would do as brilliantly as anyone else behaved in the 21st Army Group in the 11 months between D-Day and Berlin. Rebuilding the Indian Army is not simply a matter of numbers. It's a matter of esprit. It's a matter of morale. It's a matter of food. Srinath Raghavan has written a brilliant book, well, the best book on the Indian Army so far, David, until yours comes out, and he dedicates a whole chapter to calories. So the average calorific intake of an Indian peasant when they joined the army in 1942-43 was about 1,500 calories a day. Not enough to be able to sustain the energy required in combat, which ranges from 4,000 to 6,000. So how do you change the eating habits of an entire culture? You do it by introducing breakfast, chapatis and hot sugared tea at 5 o'clock in the morning. And you also encourage people to eat animal fat. How do you do that? You get dispensation from the religious leaders, Muslim and otherwise, to eat bully beef. By May, June 1945, everyone fighting in the 4th Indian Armored Corps were eating bully beef. Whether you'd started life as a vegetarian or a pescatarian or whatever other area you might have been, you were all eating bully beef. That gives you some sense of how joint and united the 14th Army was. They started with 30, and there were officially 32 ration scales in the Indian Army. By the end of the war, they were all eating bully because it was what was able to be dropped to them by aircraft. Quite an extraordinary story. David's writing about it now. Alan Jeffreys has written a brilliant book on training the Indian Army. If it's still available, make sure you read it. Dan Marston wrote, it's long out of date, but every now and again it pops up on ABE, called Phoenix from the Ashes, and it's the story of the rebuilding of the army. Srinath Raghavan's brilliant book on the Indian Army is also extremely good, really amazing book. And Raymond Callahan and Dan got together a couple of years ago and talked about Kohima and Imphal being the crucible of this transformation. This Kohima and Imphal, 1944, was the point in time when this transformation was executed for the first time. We had, a number of years ago, I was invited to go to India for the first time, and I blithely said to my Indian audience, you might have been in there, Prithvi, and of course, when the Japanese invaded India, and there was a sort of gasp from everyone in the audience, no one knew the Japanese had ever invaded India. And yet, it's incredibly important. I mean, this is a fundamental problem with Indian education. It starts, their history, for the most part, with a few honorable exceptions, of course, starts in 1947. This was a quite extraordinary operation of war, and it's been touched on once or twice. Paul mentioned it a little bit earlier, and I'll talk about some of the dimensions to this in a moment. But Mutiguchi Renya is given a bad rap by many people, including myself, but he's given a bad rap unfairly because strategically his idea was utterly brilliant. His idea was that if we're going to go in a defensive offensive to capture Manipur, We mustn't think simply about sitting at Kohima. We must take Dimapur, because Dimapur is the nodal point that will supply any future invasion of India, and it also is the nodal point for supporting the Hump airlift, of which more in a moment. Sato, commander of the 31st Army, hated Mutaguchi. Mutaguchi didn't particularly like Sato either. In fact, no one liked Mutaguchi, and he didn't like many other people either. A fundamental problem with Japanese command was their dysfunction. It is really extraordinary. And someone from the audience mentioned A.J. Barker, The March on Delhi earlier. Absolutely brilliant book. Mutaguchi was absolutely right in the introduction. He spent the rest of his life until he died in the mid-1960s complaining that Sato didn't have a strategic brain. He was absolutely 100% correct. Slim recognized this as well in Defeat into Victory. He talks about that extraordinary moment when he realized that Sato was a blockhead. And Sato had decided to invest Kohima, when what he should have done, as Paul told us earlier, was mask Kohima and march on Dimapur, the largest logistical base east of Suez, 100 square miles of fuel dumps, ammunition dumps, stores of every single kind. 21,000, there were 21,000, I discovered this week in the National Archives actually, it's amazing. 33rd Corps operational files, the G files, about this thick for March, April, May, and June. They were trying to get ammunition for the 5.5-inch guns. There were 2 5.5-inch guns in Dimapur. One was called Gertie. Anyone remember the name of the other one? I've momentarily forgotten it. There were only 21,000 rounds in the whole of India for the 5.5-inch guns. They were all in Dimapur. Just imagine what would have happened if the Japanese had got to Dimapur and cut the throat of the 14th Army. There would have been no reconquest of Burma, and the Hump airlift would probably have just stopped immediately. So a significant missed opportunity by an army that had failed to learn any of its lessons, unlike the British and Indian armies that did the opposite. And here we have Imphal and Kohima, the high point of the fighting, the success at which opened the door to the reconquest of Burma in 1945. We also had a very good lecture by Paul talking about Operation Thursday. I'm just going to add something to Paul's lecture, which I agree with virtually all of it. Is the fact that the original ambition for Operation Thursday was to support Stilwell. Now, Wingate didn't particularly like the idea of being told that his job was to provide support for Stilwell. Stilwell, of course, was coming down the Lido Road to Michenar. Mogong's just up here. His job was to sit on the railway corridor, there's the railway corridor here, and deny it to the Japanese in support of Stilwell. That never changed. And of course, when Joe Lentane took over after Wingate sadly lost his life in late March 1944, Joe Lentane refocused the effort of his remaining, effectively a division. He had 20,000 men to start with. Oops-a-daisy. On going up to support Stilwell's, am I allowed to say this publicly, sort of half-assed effort to capture Michenar. Stilwell didn't actually cover himself in glory at Michenar, and that left, as Paul said earlier, the poor old remnants, the 6,000 final members of the Chindits, Operation Thursday, struggling to deliver operational success in Mogong without mortars, without many mortars, without artillery, without heavy machine guns or medium machine guns. They didn't have Vickers. A complete cock-up. But at the same time that Thursday was going on, of course, we had Mutaguchi's invasion of India. This, in my view, was the big strategic missed opportunity of 1944. Long-range penetration, getting into the guts of the enemy, as Lord Wingate described it, was a brilliant idea. But strategically, it needs to be aligned to the purposes of the army. Bill Slim doesn't say this. This is Rob Lyman saying this. Why are we blocking the railway corridor to support Stilwell? He's got 30,000 Chinese troops and the Northern, as part of the Northern Combat Area Command, and Galahad Force, there's Merrill's Marauders, coming down here. When, if we put this box over the Chinwen, just imagine what challenges we might have been able to provide to our dear old Mutaguchi. It's food for thought. Very, very large operation, 20,000 men, 300 extraordinary aircraft in the Air Commando. Now, let me just bring you to mid-1944, because by June 1944, London, frankly, was terrified about what was happening in Burma. They all thought that the Japanese were going to win at Imphal and Kohima. It just demonstrates how far London was removed from the reality of operations. Alan Brooke wrote in his wonderful diaries, edited by Alex Danchev and Dan Todman, I think on the 21st of June 1944, I'm really worried about Imphal. Well, he needn't have been. It was on the 21st that the lead elements of the 2nd Division came down the road from, oh gosh, I'm pushing the wrong buttons, came down the road from Kohima and met up on the north of Imphal with men of the 5th Indian Division who'd been flown in earlier from the Battle of the Admin Box down here at Sinswaya. Quite extraordinarily, Slim then said, right, when I was at Staff College, I was taught to avoid the culmination point, avoid getting to the point where you are successful, or you need to pivot to the next set of actions without having a plan. That's just pretty silly. Have a plan. So to avoid culminating, he said, what do we do next? And he sent a letter, which is in the National Archives, it's republished in one of my books, a letter to Mountbatten which said, hey boss, why don't you give me permission to follow up the defeated remnants of the 15th Division across the Chinwen to northern Burma. If we can keep pressure on them, it's just generally in doctrine known as the pursuit, we will prevent them from reorganizing themselves, and we might destabilize the Japanese defense of Upper Burma. This is Upper Burma here. And Mountbatten had the good sense to say, carry on, Bill. So Bill carried on. And for the remainder of the monsoon, which ran through till August, superlatives. You all know about the monsoon, don't you? Does everyone here know about the monsoon? How many inches of rain fall in the monsoon between May and October in this part of the world? Come on, you've heard me say this before many times. Between 300 and 500 inches a year. You all complain about the 30 inches you get here. You go out here in the monsoon and you'll know what I'm talking about. So through the monsoon, all of the operations to clear up Kohima and the hill country all the way across to Jasami and the Chindwen were undertaken in the monsoon. Japanese called this the Road of Bones, quite rightly. The 5th Indian Division then drove down the Kabul Valley here to secure crossing points here at Kalemyo and Kaliwa, such that by December 1944, Slim was able to throw the lead division of the 33rd Corps, that's 19th Dagger Division under General Pete Rees, across the Chinwen. So this map hopefully will show you where everything's going on. This is where Lucy was talking about. This is where Paul was talking about. This is the Stillwell or Lido Road down to Michenar. This is the Hump airlift, which I'll mention in a moment. This is the locations in mid-1944. This was the glint in Slim's eye in June 1944. He said, why don't, if we come over here, we can then do something about ensuring the Japanese can't fight in this area here. And that's Maimyo, and there's Mandalay up here. So the glint in Slim's eye was the pursuit. And his idea initially was to advance with 2 corps, 33 Corps here and the 44 Corps here, crossing over at Kaliwa and Kalemyo to hit Mandalay. And at the same time, as Lucy explained, would have Arakan 3, which is an operation to drive down the coastline. The 82nd and 81st West African would go down the Kaladan Valley and pressure General Sakurai to get out of Akyab. And we'd have the 25th and the 26th Indian Divisions and 3 Commando Brigade smashing against the Arakanese coast. And that was the first plan. It all went belly up by mid-December because Pete Rees, as he was crossing these mountains here, these ones here, This is actually all the region of Operation Longcloth, which Paul described to you earlier. This area here, the Schwelly Triangle here, with Catherine Indoor. So he was crossing these mountains here with his 19th Indian Division, 20th Division was behind him, 2nd British Division was behind him, and he said to Slim, there are no Japanese here. Slim had assumed that General Kimura, the new commander of the Burma Area Army, about 190,000 Japs left in Burma, would fight a war in the Shwebo Plain here, where there was lots of open territory, and Slim, as a commander, said, well, if I was Kimura, that's what I would do. I'd get out there and I'd dominate all the open ground. I'd ensure that every access route towards the Irrawaddy was covered by artillery, and I wouldn't allow any enemy to move. But Slim suddenly realized that Kimura was going to fight a war to defend Mandalay here. He wasn't going to go out into the Shwebo Plain. So that left Slim with a problem, which he solved within 24 hours. He said, I know what we're going to do. Slim was never interested in fighting for ground. He was only ever interested in destroying the enemy. And he said, if I can destabilize Kimura and Mandalay, I can win all of Upper Burma. And at this stage, no one's thinking about reconquering the whole of Burma. But I can destabilize him, and I'll be able to probably win Upper Burma for the Allies before the rains come again in May. So he changed his plan. That was, and before I get to that, I'm going to remind you about another superlative, which are these crazy lines of communication. They are completely loopy. It's extraordinary every time I look at this. The only PhD and book that I'm aware of that really covers this in brilliant detail is by a chap called Colonel Graham Dunlop. He wrote his PhD in about 2004, and it's called Logistics in the Burma Campaign, I think. It's an extraordinarily good study of the lines of communication. How do you support an army fighting here or down here from Calcutta? Calcutta was the military base. Calcutta was effectively, for soldiers here, where your third line ammunition was stored. Calcutta. But Calcutta was 800 miles from Dimapur. And then there's a further 278 miles from Dimapur down to Tamu across the Naga Hills. 278. What's your maths like? What number are we at now? Come on. 800 plus 278. Yes, about 1,100 miles. So just to get to the Chinwan, you've got 1,100 miles. Then you've got another 300 miles to get to Mandalay across what is pretty empty countryside, very few villages, rough country, very, very difficult terrain, with the contours basically going due north, north-south, which means that you have to get over them up and down. It's very, very difficult. So 1,400 miles. Okay. What's that equivalent to in Europe? What's the distance between London and Moscow? 1,800. No, less than that, much less than that. No, even less than that. It's about 1,300 miles. So essentially what we're saying here is that to fight a battle in Mandalay, you're actually saying, we're going to fight a battle in Moscow to defeat the bad guys in Moscow from London. And I've got one road. And I've got lots of aircraft. I don't have many aircraft. Actually, I've only got 75 aircraft for the most of it. Each of those C-47s had a payload of 2.5 tons. So you can do the maths. We'll do some more maths in a moment when we talk about the Hump. But it's almost a crazy ask, isn't it? It's really, really crazy to think about. And then when you add another 300 to 400 miles from Mandalay down to Rangoon, we're talking about 1,800 miles, which is the distance from London to Beirut. You know, this is why no one in Delhi or London in 1944 thought that the reconquest of Burma was ever possible. So here's another superlative. We've got a general of an army that makes the impossible happen. It's extraordinary, isn't it? What an incredible story. Why aren't we all shouting about this? Why aren't PhD students lining up to go to the National Archives and look at these incredible files that have never been opened and write their PhDs and their brilliant books on this unbelievable army? We don't know about it, and we should all be thoroughly ashamed of it, not present company excluded. And those people in the audience doing PhDs, congratulations. Just keep on going. So So before I talk about Slim's great maneuver, we need to have in our head the great challenges of time, geography, and distance. Slim came up very quickly, because I don't want to run out of time, which I'm likely to do, with a plan that said, okay, I'm going to keep the 33rd Corps going this way. I'm going to scrub this maneuver. I'm going to double the amount of signals traffic on 33rd Corps to make Kimura here in Mandalay think that there is the whole of the 14th Army coming at him across the Irrawaddy and down the east side of the Irrawaddy to Mandalay. So he keeps his forces in Upper Burma. In the meantime, I'm going to take the whole of the 4th Indian Armoured Corps, which includes the two fantastic Indian divisions, 7th Indian Division and 17th Indian Division under Punch Cowan, which has been fighting since the very start of the campaign in 1942. Punch Cowan has commanded it from Satang, the time that General Jackie Smith, VC, was sacked. 28th East African Brigade, the 125 Shermans of the 255th Tank Brigade, quite an extraordinary tank brigade by this time of the war, and the Lushai Brigade. And I'm going to attack the most vulnerable point in Kimura's defense. If you're a soldier, you will remember when you do your appreciations about what you need to be doing, you look at the enemy, courses of actions, and you say, so what? Well, there's no point me putting the bulk of my combat power against the bulk of the enemy's combat power, is there? And yet most soldiers tend to do that. What you need to be doing is you need to be putting the bulk of your combat power against the enemy's vulnerabilities. Where is he weakest? Exploit his vulnerabilities. Slim sat there and over a period of 24 hours said, I'm going to send half of my army to Mektila. If I can capture Mektila, it will prevent any reinforcements getting up to Mandalay from Rangoon. It will deny Kimura all his major airfields. There are 3 airfields at Mektila. It will tie up a big bunch of Kimura's troops. And if I'm lucky, it'll force Kimura to divert his army from here down to try and remove me in Mektila. And to cut a very long story short, that's precisely what he did in Operation Extended Capital. Well, how do you get down to a place called Pakiku? You go down the Gangor Valley. There is nothing but jungle tracks down the Gangor Valley. You've got to take 155 tanks. How do you do it when there's no road? You put a bulldozer ahead of you. You work 24/7. You work under the canopy of trees in a great long line of tanks and vehicles working for 6 weeks. Crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. Slim got away with it because everyone in 14th Army headquarters and Mountbatten were supporting him. We don't have time to talk about lease today, but we'll come back to that at another lecture. And to cut a very long story short, as you all know, General Frank Messervy managed to capture Mektila in a quite brilliant action, in which the new Indian Army showed itself off in all its combined arms glory, a really extraordinary feat of arms. At the same time, as Lucy was describing, the operations were being undertaken to force General Shoujo Sakurai out of Arakan. And at the same time, finally, in August 1944, Northern Combat Area Command managed to capture Michenar. Stilwell was then, at that stage, sacked. 36th Division came in and started clearing down the railway corridor, as was brilliantly described to us earlier by Paul. So that's Operation Extended Capital, one of the most extraordinary operations of war. Military theoreticians call this a maneuverist campaign because it wasn't attritional. It wasn't a matter of stepping forward with overwhelming firepower against the enemy. It was a matter of identifying the enemy's key vulnerabilities and putting, with all the risk that entailed, putting his forces, Slim's forces, at the neck of the Japanese, at the throat of the Japanese at Mektila. Quite extraordinary. I mentioned the Hump a few times. Paul mentioned the Hump a few times. There is a brilliant book on the Hump by Caroline Alexander, and I've forgotten the name of it. What's it called? Caroline Alexander's book. Anyway, it came out last year. It's really, really exceptional. Please do go and buy a copy of it. At the time, it was the largest logistical exercise undertaken in human history. Now, I've done this exercise for a few of you before. I hope you remember. Over 900 days between the end of 1942 and the start of 1945, the Hump airlift moved 650,000 tons of supplies to China and brought back Chinese troops and empty 44-gallon fuel cans, drums, to India. I've already told you the payload of a C-47 at DC-3 Dakota. What was the payload of a C-47? 2.5 tons. So what's the math? 900 days, 650,000 tons. How many aircraft are required to be in the air every day? This is 24/7 between the end of 1942 and the start of 1945. It's about 280 every single day. 24/7 they were flying day in, night out. An extraordinary operation of war to keep China in the war. Everyone involved in the Hump airlift in terms of the planning up in Dobruja and Lido were then subsequently involved, all the entire command team, as Giles Milton describes in his brilliant book on the Berlin airlift, were involved in the Berlin airlift in 1949. If it wasn't for the Hump airlift, we wouldn't have had success in Berlin a few years later. A really quite extraordinary operation of war. 650 aircraft lost. The pilots called it the aluminum trail. That's actually a C-46, which takes a little bit more. The C-46 was notoriously ill-prepared for operations of war, and many of them came down through mechanical failure, including the one on Panksha in August 1943. There's a very good book on that subject, which I recommend to you as well. The Hump airlift, another superlative of the Burma campaign. How long have I got? I've no idea what time we started, 1:45. I probably need to finish now. We've already had, these are actually the 11th East Africans, folks, not the West Africans. These guys are actually not even an Arakan. I put this photograph up because it's a great photograph. These guys are coming down the Irrawaddy. These are the 28th East African Brigade coming down the Irrawaddy in support of Messavi's attack across at Nyangu. We've had the strategic maneuver described to us brilliantly by Lucy, so I won't dwell on that. I am going to talk very quickly about Operation Character, because we had at least two very, very significant special force operations in Burma. One was the Chindits. The other one was Operation Character in April 1942, where 104 or thereabouts British, Indian, and Burmese officers and NCOs jumped into the Karen Hills, trained up 12,000 Karen levies, gave them 3 weeks musketry training and Bren gun training and grenade training. Slim had taken over SOE, Special Operations Executive. He had command responsibility for SOE, known in the Far East as Force 136. From January 1945, Slim had a massive problem to deal with. He had beaten the Japanese at Mektila. He then had another glint in the eye. Slim had a few glints in his eye. And that was, why can't we capture the whole of Burma before the rains come in May? It's 6 weeks away. What do I need to do? I've got 400 miles to go. How do I do it? Because I have to get my army through this massive defile in the Satang River Valley where Tungu sits. It's rugged. On the left-hand side, I've got the Pegu Yuma. On the right-hand side, I've got the Karen Hills. Colonel Edgar Peacock, a brilliant new book, a biography by Richard Duckett. It's fantastic, and I really encourage you all to go and buy it. I think there's a copy upstairs. KT have got copies of the book out there. Please do buy it. Peacock went to Slim and said, I've got an answer for you, boss. I can raise the Karen levies. They've been desperate to get at the Japanese, thinking of the right word to use then, desperate to get at the Japanese since 1942. They had harbored the wonderful Hugh Seagram, GC. And if we train the Karen levies, they can stop the Japanese army coalescing on Tungu and defending it. Because if Tungu is defended, the 4th Indian Armoured Corps will have a jolly difficult job getting through Tungu. To cut a long story short, because I know I have run out of time, 12,000 Karen levies were mobilized. They were given the attack order. They dispersed right across the hills from the Morchi Road down, and they killed about 14,000 Japanese. They also took about 11,000, unbelievably, 11,000 Japanese prisoner, or forced them to become POWs. And unheard of in the Japanese army. The whole of Operation Ugo, the invasion of India, there were 600 Japanese prisoners, all of whom were, not all of whom, some were volunteers. There's some very interesting POW records of Japanese, which I've discovered recently, Japanese POWs saying, I like England, I don't want to continue fighting. Seriously, I'm going to put it in my next book, it's great stuff. But it's very, very unusual to have Japanese surrender. And this achieved dramatic operational effect because it allowed the 4th Indian Armored Corps to drive in to Toungoo at speed, and the leading regiment talks about running over Japanese military policemen directing traffic in Toungoo. Serious and a true story. Quite a remarkable operational war. We also had, in terms of superlatives, Britain's greatest general. And he really was extraordinary. And this quotation from him in a lecture to Sandhurst many years later really sums up his approach to war. I'm going to read it because it's really important. I talked about the difference between attrition and maneuver. Focus on attacking where an enemy is weak in terms of his combat power, rather than where he's strong. Avoid direct confrontation with the enemy mass by the use of all weapons, ballistic or otherwise, including psychological. Persuade the enemy you're doing something that he doesn't think you're doing, without engaging in attritional slogging matches. This is classic Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu said, the masterful general is one who wins battles without fighting. Well, it doesn't mean you don't have to fight, and that's a misnomer people have to get their heads around. Maneuver warfare often includes hard fighting, but you're fighting in the right place with the right weapons for the right objectives. There we are.